Good morning. Well, it's wonderful to digitally be here with you all today. My name is the Reverend David Pyle. I am the regional lead for the Mid-America region of the UUA. But a while ago, I was also on the Central East regional staff and was the liaison to the Commission Lay Ministry program. It's wonderful to be back with you all, at least in this digital format. I had wanted to be present at least live with you all for this presentation, but this is a busy time of year with ministerial startups, and so I am uh, bilocating today to be present with you all to present this material on governance in UU congregations. And I'm also doing a ministerial startup in Louisville, Kentucky at First Unitarian Universalist Church of Louisville. So it is wonderful to be with you. I'm also not going to worry too much about the whether I get everything right in this presentation today as far as video presenting, because many of you all know me, and I'm not going to record this thing multiple times. So if I stumble in words, just go with me. It'll all be good, and I will hopefully be able to come in for some question and answer with you all before your time together is today. But I'm excited to be able to come talk to you about governance, and that's a strange sentence for many people, except for me, because I have for the last oh gosh, it's 12 years been one of the UUA's primary governance consultants and had the privilege to work with probably close to 100 different UU congregations on issues related to governance, and closer to 400 on congregations over the last 12 years in 3 different regions on all the many things that the congregational life staff of the UUA support congregations on. And in some of those cases, I've gotten to work closely with commission lay ministers from the Central East region. So I have a love of this program, and I was honored that you all asked me to come talk to you all today about governance. And thank you for your understanding in me needing to bilocate and be in 2 locations at once. So our learning objectives. Some of you know that I am also an Army Reserve chaplain, and so you never do a training in the Army without naming the learning objectives at the beginning. So our learning objectives for today include, getting to a baseline theory of governance in UU congregations, hoping that everyone has, really a core understanding of how we make decisions together in congregations. Talking to really understand the 3 levels of congregational governance and how they interact, because every congregational system has not one level of governance, it has 3. And a lot of the confusion that people have about how we make decisions together in congregations comes from not understanding that there are 3 different systems about how to make decisions operating at the same time in every congregation. We'll look at governance process through the lenses of structure and process and practice. We'll also look at some of the 8, my opinion, major types of organization at what we'll call level 2, or the board executive configuration in congregations, which is what most people mean when they say governance, is that relationship between the executive, however it's formed, and the governing board, however it's formed. We'll take a close look at understanding some of the specifics of how congregational lay ministry interacts with congregational governance, both some of the challenges of that and also some of the blessings. And we'll look at some of the boundaries around commission lay ministry and how congregations make decisions together and why those boundaries exist and are important. So because I'm not live with you all, you can't be putting questions in the chat that I would then respond to. But what I want to invite you to do is to grab a piece of paper or a pen or something, or digital, tablet or a phone. And as you have questions as we go through, jot those down. Take note of them. One, that you can have some conversation with each other. There will be some shared questions for you all to engage in small groups, but also so that when we have the question and answer session, when I call you all from the boardroom at First Unitarian Louisville, Kentucky, that if you've got those questions already laid out, it'll be easier for us to be able to make that some good productive time together. So Hopefully, that sounds like a good plan because I can't check with you all to see if it's a good plan for the day, but that's what my goal is of what we're going to try, the material we're going to try to engage today. So I'm going to start with this presentation is really in four parts. The first part is really me presenting my theory of governance, of congregational governance, of how we make decisions together in Unitarian Universalist congregations. And I want to own that this is my theory. Everybody that does congregational governance consulting approaches it from a different theory base. And the best thing I can do in working with a congregation or teaching a class or a workshop such as this is to let you all know my theory at the beginning. That way, you can judge what I share based upon that theory. No one is ever, I don't believe any human being is ever unbiased. And because we are never unbiased, the best we can do is to let people know what is the basis we're coming from so that they can then assess what we share from that space. And this is we're going to start off with my attempt at sharing the core elements of my theory of how we make decisions together in congregations. So the the first piece is just that governance as a word is a fancy way to say how we make decisions together. One of the spiritual practices of Unitarian Universalism is the idea that we are in community with one another. And being in community with one another, we have to learn and practice how to make decisions together, how to make decisions where voices are heard, where people are engaged, where more than just individual interests are being taken into account and practiced. And so governance is at its core a spiritual practice for our faith tradition. It is the practice of making decisions together, making decisions that include the all those who have made the commitment to be part of a congregation. Um, Governance is only important in that it creates the structure, process, and practice whereby congregations can make decisions in community. Um, if you weren't trying to make decisions in community, if you were just going to have one person make the decisions for the community on behalf of the community, then you wouldn't really need governance. You wouldn't really need the structures and process to do this together. And governance is itself, for me, then becomes a spiritual practice of our faith. One that I wish humanity was a little better at, even beyond the walls of our congregations, how we are in community with one another and how we make decisions in that community. Governance, another aspect of my theory is that governance is always a balance between efficiency and inclusion. That the easiest way for a congregation to make decisions together is to have one person make the decisions on behalf of the congregation. That is by far the most efficient, right? It's one person making those decisions. It's probably not the best practice, but it's also not the most inclusive. It is not the community making the decisions together. And so the more inclusive processes tend to be the least efficient, and the more efficient processes tend to be the least inclusive. And finding the balance, not just for your congregation, but for the decision and for the particular level of governance that is being practiced at that moment, is a bit of an art form. Learning how to and building the lessons from that art form into your policy, into your practices, into your structure on how you're going to make decisions as a community. Uh, every human being, I wrote this in here, every human system that involves two or more humans involves an exercise of power. I sometimes think that is an obvious statement, but then I realize how it's not. That power is so often hidden in at least in Western culture and society that we don't acknowledge that whenever human beings are interacting. And frankly, it's probably true that I can just speak for me, but in me, when I am by myself making a decision on my own, there's probably also some power dynamics going on internally between the many different versions of me. So the reality is that anytime we are making decisions together, anytime human beings are interacting with one another, that is an exercise in power. And how to hold power in community is another aspect of why I think governance is a spiritual practice in Unitarian Universalism. So every congregation, because congregations are groupings of people, um, hopefully that share similar values, commitments, mission, and belief, but not always. But every congregation is an exercise in power. And in congregations, power tends to happen in two primary ways. I structure these as formal power and informal power. Formal power is the authority or the power that is recognized by the congregation's official structure, by process, by practice. So when the board, the governing board, which is elected by the congregation's meeting in most cases, when that governing board is making decisions on behalf of the congregation within the structures of the bylaws, within the board policy, that is formal power. That is the power that the congregation formally has granted to those individuals by role of their position. Informal power is all the other ways that decisions get made in congregation. I want to come back. Let me say one thing about formal power. Formal power is also if your congregation has a minister that has been hired or called, or a religious educator that has been hired, or it could be called, or a staff person, an administrator that is in a role that the congregation has placed them in with particular sets of responsibilities and that is also formal power, right? That is that if the religious educator is choosing a curriculum, that is a formal exercise of power. Um, uh, but congregations also are experience a lot of what I call informal power. And sometimes governance consultants will say formal power good, informal power bad. I am not in that space. Both of these are true. They are normal. They are human. Formal systems of power and informal systems of power are happening all the time, all around us in every moment. They just are. And the key is, and we'll talk about this a little while, is to keep them in balance. To keep formal and informal systems of power in community with each other, in balance, and moving in the same direction. But informal power is all of the ways that decisions get made, that power is exercised through relationship, through tenure, through money, through influence, through information, through secrets, and what I call tree rings. One of the things I have sometimes done for congregations is to do an assessment of a congregation's bylaws. And I can go through those bylaws and I can find almost every major conflict that the congregation has had written as a tree ring inside the bylaws, right? That this particular formulation of how our minister was called, that is not standard. That has a history behind it, and that history is a tree ring in looking at governance documents. Um, but in most UU congregations, informal power. This is sometimes a bit hard for people to understand, especially those new to Unitarian Universalism. But the informal power is often over stronger. I said greater in the slide. That's a little not exactly right. Stronger. That the ways that decisions get made, ministers and others would say to me, well, every time the board makes a decision, it seems to get unmade on the phone between, long-term members late, like 2 or 3 days later. That's because in many of our congregations, informal power is a stronger structure. It is more effective, partly because it is more efficient. because it involves less people. Informal power tends to not uh, be structured in such a way as to bring in the wider voice of individuals, as to it tends to be expressed in ways that are limited in who has the ability to affect that informal power decision. But both of these are true. Both happen all the time in every human community, and our congregations are no exception. The key is not formal power good, informal power bad. The key is to keep them in balance. And one of the things I will share is that I think that commissioned lay ministers, particularly in congregations, in smaller congregations, but even in some larger ones, have a responsibility to help the congregation manage their informal power systems. Um, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Um, Formal power is the one most likely to develop as stronger over time. So informal power systems, they are almost self-generating. And over time, informal power systems do tend to weaken, partially because the people that hold that informal power change roles, change congregations, leave us. And it's harder for people to develop that informal power, to develop those relationships and those structures, and the other ways that you can influence decision making in a congregation. Um, and over time, intentional focus on strengthening a congregation's structural, formal power systems like the board, like committee chairs, can lead to, over time, those more formal systems developing. But it takes some intentional effort. It takes some focus on strengthening the congregation's formal power systems. A decision getting remade on the phone, 3 days after a board meeting, then being challenged to say, no, no, the board is the formal power. The board has the authority here. The board made the decision. We're going to stick with the decision that the board made, rather than the decision being remade by the informal power system. I said this a few minutes ago because I always jump my slides. They're not bad. They are normal, and they're necessary. A congregation that just has a formal power system um, lacks in some of the nuance, lacks access to some of the history, lacks access to some of the congregational culture. The congregations that only have informal power systems uh, feel or have really, really weak structural formal power systems, um, feel disempowered, feel as if only a few people have any authority and have any ability to make any decisions. And the rest of us, this isn't really our congregation. Um, uh, so the key is for there to be balance, respect, and communication between these formal and informal power systems. One of the pieces of advice I will regularly give to a congregational president is to go find the people who, because you know who they are in a congregation, who have informal power. To I'll tell a congregational president to be in regular conversation with them, to reach out to those people. Not that they're going to make the decision for you or tell you what to do as the board president, but being in conversation with them, letting them know that they have a way that they can communicate what the informal power system is experiencing, actually helps keep that informal power system more in line with the formal power system of the board and the bylaws and the committee chairs and the governance and the staff. Um, but it is true that often when I'll be working with a congregation on governance issues, there will be some significant lack of balance between the formal and the informal power system. And uh, addressing that, rebalancing, is often can be a really difficult task because it's not just a structural change. It is a relational change. Some of the other language we've used in other workshops, which I'm sure some of our CLMs are aware of, is that shifting the balance or rebalancing between a formal power system and an informal power system in a congregation, that is an adaptive change, not a technical change. You can't just put a structure on a PowerPoint and say, this is how the congregation is going to work now. You have to work on the relationships. You have to go do really kind of pastoral care within the congregation's governance system. And that is the thing I think commission lay ministers are are key in doing well, helping the congregation to keep that formal and informal power system in balance, in communication, and in respectful relationship with each other. So one of the things I want to talk a little bit about, formal power systems, people get it. They're written on the bylaws. If you've read a couple congregational bylaws, you understand what a formal power system looks like. Read a congregation's, board policies, seen a board function. If you know a little bit about Robert's Rules of Order, how it gets a little messy between the board and the executive. That's a conversation we'll have in a few minutes. But for the most part, we understand how the formal power systems are supposed to work. Informal power systems are also a system. Um, Congregations develop these systems over time. Uh, in one congregation that I was a part of, uh, in my early days of being a seminarian, um, everybody knew that there was one member of the congregation. I will call her Mary. Everybody knew that Mary was the one that approved any decision made by anyone else. Mary had been in the congregation forever, had been one of its founding members. And if you wanted, everybody knew that if you wanted anything to actually happen, whether you were the board or not, Mary had to be on board with whatever that was. That is a system. That is how the congregation functions as a system. And so how those relationships work between the people within the informal power systems. And there will be people who have roles both in the system of the informal power system and in the system of the formal power system. Um, you can make an argument that commission lay ministers, I think there's more than an argument. By your commissioning, you have a formal power system role. You also have significant, by being elders in the congregation, by being trusted enough to be commissioned, you also have some significant informal role in the informal power system as well. So I want to start us with I'm bookmarking a few questions, and these will also be at the end, and you're going to be able to engage them afterwards. That in your small groups, that there are some questions I would love you to engage. Um, and the first one is this. It's multiple questions, but it's all in one lane, if you will. So I want you to think about which is stronger in your congregation, the formal power system, which is the board, committees, or staff, or the informal power system, which is the elders, the relationships, the large donors, the people with great experience, the only person who knows how the coffee machine works. What's stronger between those two systems? Are they in balance? And if they're not in balance, why? And in which of those two power systems, the formal or informal, do you think that you most often operate as a commission lay minister? And where I've given my a hint to my thought on this, but where can the commission lay minister have the greatest positive and boundaried impact upon your congregational system? Upon, is it in the formal power system or the informal power system of the congregation? You all know I love slide transitions. It's my favorite part of PowerPoint. And so there's a few more coming, just so you know. So a little bit more on my governance theory. Uh, I don't believe that there is any right way for a UU congregation to organize how we make decisions together. That each UU congregation is almost like a snowflake, and how congregations make decisions together really adapts based upon their history, their culture, their location. I will tell you, the congregations in the Washington, D.C. area, where so many people are in the Washington, D.C. culture, they make decisions differently than the congregations in Minneapolis. Because of the culture of the community that they are a part of changes some of the ways in which how the congregations make decisions together. And I will also say it's a wonderful thing as a governance consultant that all of our congregations do this a little differently because it means I am never out of work. There's never going to be a point where a book is written, even if a book were written by me, that would solve all of our challenges and quandaries around how we make decisions together. But I think that there are six or eight major structural systems, and we'll talk about what level two governance is in UU congregations. And our congregations, I love this phrase, I learned it from someone, from another consultant, are endlessly governance creative. That one of the ways I know that governance is a spiritual practice in UU congregations is because of how creative our congregations can be. Somebody will call me and say, David, we'd like some advice on how to structure our committee of the whole. I have no idea what that is. You invented it. I've never heard of it before. I've been doing this for over 15 years, as a governance consultant. So tell me what it's supposed to do, and then maybe I can help you. Because we are endlessly governance creative as Unitarian Universalists, because we are always looking for ways that we can make decisions together in a better, more communal way. Um, Also, in the absence of a unifying theology, congregations sometimes get really attached to their decision-making processes. And this is not just new, just a dynamic for Unitarian Universalists. If you think about how some religious denominations besides us are named, we're actually named for two theologies. But that is maybe not the norm because if you think about it, Presbyterians are named for a governance practice, having presbyteries. Episcopalians are named for a governance practice, having bishops. The you know so there are quite a few Congregationalists, of which we are part of that tradition, are named for a governance practice, which is decisions being made by the congregation. So realize knowing how governance, how we make decisions together as a spiritual practice has been foundational to much of Western religion, at least in the last 3 or 4 centuries. Um, the the and the more we invest our identity in governance, that's a practice. I have always thought that some of the reasons why we invest so much in how we make decisions together is because we want that practice. We want that process to be what holds the center, to be the commitment we make to each other. But here's where I think there's some wisdom in that, is because the method is the message. Because how we make decisions together is the message of the kind of community that we want to create and that we want to build in the world. That governance is one of the ways in which living the beloved community that is central to, I think, our lived theology as a faith is most put in practice and is sometimes the most difficult to live. Told you I love slide transitions. So I wanted to give some thoughts for commissioned lay ministers within this conception, my conception of how governance works and what it is in UU congregations. And the first is that I think commissioned lay ministers are key to helping these two different power systems, the informal power system and the formal power system, to remain in balance in a congregation, because you have a formal power system role at what we'll call level three governance, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. You have an official role, but you also have the relationships. And one of my concerns is that the more formal power system roles you have beyond being a commissioned lay minister, the less you're able to leverage your relational space in those informal power system ways to help keep those two systems in balance in a congregation. That CLMs in a congregation can help to manage the relationships in the informal system. Ministers and staff also do this, but ministers and staff have a much more clearly defined formal power system role and often end up being placed, whether they want to be or not, in um, positions with the informal power system that can feel adversarial. um, that commission lay ministers don't always end up in that same kind of relationship with the informal power systems. And so the ability for CLMs to be able to keep those two systems, the informal and the formal power systems in balance and in respectful relationship and communication with each other, I think is a key gift that CLMs can provide in congregational governance. And the other side of it is that we UUA staff, we don't know who, if we worked with the congregation long enough, we can figure it out. But for the most part, we don't know the informal power system in the congregation. That's not who we relate with. Our role is to relate to, support, and to strengthen the congregation's formal power systems of elected leaders and committees. And so CLMs are in a space that even we congregational life consultants, we don't often get access to. And frankly, if we have access to the informal power systems, it's because some things have gone really poorly. For us to be able to be that involved and that aware of the informal power systems in a congregation. So I'm going to shift to part two, the second part of this presentation. And I know that's the longest of the parts. It's the one I wanted to spend the most time on because one, for you to be able to judge everything else I share in light of that, that theory of congregational governance, but also to lay the foundation for a way to understand how decisions get made in congregations. Because there's not one governance system, formal power governance system in any congregation. There are three. And the confusion between the three levels of formal power congregational governance is the actual place of most governance challenges that I've addressed. The relationship between the informal power and the formal power system, that's a relational issue in the congregation, and it exists in every congregation. It is always there. But when I do a governance assessment of a congregation, most of the governance challenges I find are between these three different levels of congregational governance. And so let me take a few minutes and talk through those three levels. They'll make sense. Hang with me. So the first level of congregational governance, formal power congregational governance, is the congregational meeting and its relationship to the bodies it creates. So, for example, your congregation has an annual meeting and may also have a special meeting. Some congregations have two or three annual meetings a year. I met one congregation that had an annual meeting once a month, but they were like 12 people. And so, everybody coming together to make a decision was the congregational meeting. The that is the most inclusive type of governance, but it's also the least efficient. But it's the relationship not just of the annual meeting, but the level one is the relationship between the annual meeting and the bodies it creates. So the primary body that is created by the annual meeting, most often created in the Constitution, the incorporation documents, or the bylaws, is the board. So the relationship between the annual meeting and the board is what I call a level one governance relationship. Some congregations also say create an endowment committee or an endowment board. And it's created by the congregational meeting. It is responsible to the congregational meeting. That is a level one relationship. Many congregations, the nominating committee is created by the annual meeting and they are responsible to the annual meeting. So that is also a level one governance relationship. Your congregation, if your congregation has a called minister, that minister has been called by a vote of the annual meeting, of the congregational meeting of the congregation. That relationship between the congregational meeting, the congregation as a whole, and that called minister is a level one governance relationship. And that piece can create unending problems because the minister also has a level two governance relationship. So the real conception here is to realize that at that level, those relationships between the congregational meeting and the bodies it creates, that's the first level of congregational governance. And it's the level at which most people have the most authority, but it is the least efficient for actually making decisions. The second level is the congregational governing board and its relationship to any bodies it creates. So this is what most people think of when they think of governance. They think of level two governance relationships. And so the congregational meeting creates the board. And the board, then that's a level one relationship. And then the board then creates other relationships. The board might create a standing finance committee. The relationship between the board and the standing finance committee is a level two relationship. The board might create a religious education committee. That relationship is a level two relationship. The board might hire or contract with a minister or with a religious educator. Those are level two governance relationships between the board and the bodies that it creates. And this is the documents at this level. This is governing policies, board and operational policies. The majority of policies in most congregations are level two policies. There is such a thing as level three policies. We'll talk about that in a minute. But level three is the relationship. Remember, I said that the board has a relationship with the minister, or it could be with an executive body that's another format. But the board, in some congregations, the board is running the congregation. The board is also effectively the executive. But it is considered better practice if the board is able to delegate, create a body to be the executive function of the congregation. Sometimes that is the minister. Sometimes that is an executive director. Sometimes that is a team. Sometimes that's a team that's all staff. Sometimes it's a team that's both staff and members. Some of commissioned lay ministers may actually be on the body that is the executive in your congregation as a commissioned lay minister. Um, but the level three relationships are the relationship between the executive, however it's formed and structured, and its relationship to any bodies it creates. I give an example of one of the congregations I served. We had a pastoral associates team. That relationship between the executive, me as one of the ministers, and that pastoral associates team, that's a level three relationship, right? So level one is the relationship between the congregational meeting and its relationship to the bodies it creates. Level two is the governing board and its relationship to the bodies it creates. And level three is the executive, however it's formed, and its relationship to the bodies it creates. And we see this in how the policy structure, how the document structures for congregations also lay out. So this is sometimes called the mixing bowls metaphor. There's Nested Bowls is a governance book written by Laura Park that is a good read, especially for if you want to know about policy governance. But this metaphor, Dan Hotchkiss uses this metaphor in governance ministry, this metaphor of understanding a congregation's governance structure. So the biggest bowl, nested mixing bowls that sit inside each other so they don't take up much space in the cabinet. The biggest bowl, the red one in that picture, that's your foundational documents. That is your they are level one governance documents. So your constitution, your articles of incorporation, your bylaws. Not every state requires you have a constitution or articles of incorporation. There could be other level one, the documents that create your endowment committee or program. But if they are documents that were approved by and have to be modified, and if they're going to be modified, it has to be by the congregational meeting. Those are your level one documents. Level two, the middle bowl, the yellow bowl in this picture. These are your level two, your governance documents, your board governance documents, or your policy governance documents. Those are your governance policies, your operational policies in some congregations. In some congregations, all the operational policies are are promulgated by the staff. But if it is a document, a foundational document, a structured document, that the board has to be the one to approve, to give the final approval for that. That is a level two governance document. Like most ministerial contracts are level two governance documents. Most governance policies or policies for on safe congregations policies, for example, those are often level two documents. And then your small bowl, that blue bowl that's in there, those are your both procedures, but they are also what I call level three governance documents. So in some congregations, the policy is not approved by the board. It's approved by the executive, by the staff leadership. But all the things that are about how, when, and what we do, those are your level three governance documents. And these all sit together within inside a congregation. Now, do congregations usually have all of these? No. Most congregations actually do pretty well on their level one governance documents because the state requires it. And they do go back and look at them from time to time and revamp. But level two governance documents, some congregations, especially as they grow a little bit bigger and are practicing some form of governance by policy, do develop some policies. But one of the things I learned working with congregations was uh, often I would ask congregations when I was going to do a governance consultation with them, I would tell them to give me all of their policies, every policy that had ever been passed, all of their governance documents, level one, level two, level three, put them together for me. And more often than not, that was the first time they'd ever been collected and put in one place. They had existed on this president's hard drive or that president's flash drive or this former minister's files, and the congregation had to go through an exercise to collect all those and bring them in one place. And they needed to do it for me so that I could, do the review I needed to do, but that was a good end into itself, letting them gather all those things together and find them. So looking at the three levels of congregational governance, uh, just to recap, the congregational meeting creates the governing board, most often through bylaws, sometimes through constitutions. The governing board then creates and empowers the executive through policy, usually a governing policy that defines who the executive is, whether it's the minister or a lay staff team or an all staff team. That is defined through policy. And then the executive conducts the ministries and the operations of the congregation. All three of those are governance. How you make decisions in level three, how you make decisions in conducting the ministries and the operations of the congregations, that is the congregation making decisions together. And so most commission lay ministers that I've had experience with are deeply involved in the congregation's governance at level three, at the level of conducting the ministries and the operations of the congregations. And I will say that it can be complicated to be trying to do governance work at multiple levels at the same time. Ministers do it. Ministers actually operate at all three levels all the time. But they don't always do it well. I know how difficult it is. I as the regional lead for the Mid America region, which is a separate nonprofit from the UUA, integrated, interdependent, but separate nonprofit. I have to operate at all three levels. And I will tell you, it is one of the more difficult aspects of my ministry. knowing which level of government. And I'm the one that wrote this, that came up with this way to conceive of how our congregations work, and operating, knowing which level I am in a particular decision, knowing what my authority is at that level, knowing what my authority is not at that level, and functioning appropriately for the level of decision making governance that we are doing. That's a difficult task. It's easier for most people to choose to be in one level of the congregation's governance, where or for most of their engagement in a congregation. I, and I just this may go without being said, but the congregational meeting is held accountable by the members of the congregation through votes, through the board is held accountable by the congregational meeting, and the executive is held accountable by the governing board. This is how the three levels work together. They create each other, as we saw in the last slide, and they hold each other accountable, as we see in this slide. Um, and I will say that it is sometimes one of the more challenging things in our congregations, one of the places where governance breaks down, is a minister, if the minister is the executive. The minister is called by the congregation in a level one relationship. So, but they are the executive at level three. Then sometimes a minister will try to make the case that the board actually cannot hold them accountable because they are responsible to the whole congregation, not to the board. But the key is that's the minister as an individual. The board policy at level two creates the executive, and it is the minister functioning as the executive that the board is responsible for holding accountable to policy, holding accountable to the congregation's mission, holding accountable to practice. Because remember, level one is the least efficient governance system. Level three is the most efficient governance system. Level two is the balance of efficiency and inclusion in between. And so um, uh, when a minister is saying that they don't believe that the board has the ability to hold them accountable because they were called by the congregation through the congregational meeting, what they are asking for is that the least efficient system in the congregation be the only one that can hold them accountable. And that's problematic. Um, which I just said. I call this an echelon problem. The call minister is primarily responsible to the congregational meeting, not the board. I told you I would jump my slides. Um, the the it's also usually a problem that somebody who is playing at different levels in the congregational system at the same time. I might be a great, wonderful religious education teacher, and I am really passionate about religious education, or let's go with what was true, really passionate about OWL, our whole lives. And so, but I'm also a board member. So when I go into the board, I want to advocate for the thing I am most passionate about, which is religious education and OWL our whole lives. But then I'm not functioning as a board member. I am not functioning appropriately at the level of governance, at level two, at the board. I'm still functioning at level three, at that operational level. I'm not looking towards the vitality of the mission of the whole congregation. Um, so this challenge between levels is, like I said, one of the primary governance challenges that I encounter. And congregations with operational boards, so boards who are themselves the executive in the system. This tends to be smaller congregations, but not always. Often conflate the level two and level three into one body, where the board is also the executive. Uh, Two challenges with that. One, the boards tend to overwork massively. And two, they get drawn into the operational and never have time for the strategic. So they never do the actual work that a level two board would do because they are too busy running and managing the congregation. I said this before. This is just a refresher or the place in the slides where it jumps in. Level one, the congregational meeting. That is the most inclusive level of governance and the least efficient. Level two is the median level of inclusivity and efficiency and has a priority of uh, managing the balance in the system uh, to create trust. And level three is the most efficient level of governance. I, as the executive, can just make the decision. But it's often the least inclusive, and it requires trust to function well. And one of the things that, as an executive in a congregational system, you learn that you don't just make decisions by yourself, that you build a team of trusted people that you can assess because eventually, the more in a UU congregational setting, the more you make decisions directly by yourself and not in relationship, the more the other two governance systems are going to be reactive to the decisions you make. So every governance system describes the relationship between and within the governance levels. And this is done through bylaws, this is done through policy, this is done through procedures or practice that happen in an executive system at a congregation. Um, and it regulates the way these interact with each other. I will never forget, I was doing work with a large congregation, 1,000+ member congregation. And a member of the congregation, I was doing an interview of people in the congregation, and one of the members said, why does this minister keep telling us what to do in pastoral care? Aren't we his boss? 1,000+ member congregation. And this is someone who is having a conflation issue, right? Between their role in level three, which is to help do the pastoral ministries of the congregation, versus their role at level one, which is to call the minister. And the that challenge plays out in congregational governance over and over and over again. One of the keys is to be able to know which level of congregational decision making of governance are you operating in at that moment in that role, and to stay at that level. Um, uh, and different congregational systems, these different levels, they don't all operate the same. How you make decisions at the congregational meeting level at level one and how the executive makes decisions at level three based upon the ministries and the operations of the congregations can be radically different and can function in very different systems and formats. So, so at level one, the most common, overwhelmingly common governance system at level one is what we call congregational polity. And I'm not doing a class in congregational polity today. I think most of you can track that. There are multiple different rules of order. Personally am a fan of Roberta's rules of order, but there are several different, and it operates under state nonprofit law, at that level. But most of our congregations, overwhelmingly, I think I've only encountered one that I would say did not practice congregational polity. That was more of a Presbyterian system. They operate at the annual meeting functions through a form of congregational polity. There are many different governance systems that you see operating at level two. Um, uh, these are the most common names that people associate with the word governance in Unitarian Universalism. Um, I'm not going to do classes in each of these today, or really what their difference is. I'm just naming that there are many different systems that regulate the relationship between the congregational board and the executive. Policy governance in one of its many forms being Carver style or Unity Consulting style. Dan Hotchkiss's governance and ministry is a version of this. Mission-based governance, which is a system that I teach that is actually a version or a derivation of governance and ministry by Dan Hotchkiss. Or dynamic governance, which is an interesting system that different UU groups are playing with that are about interlocking circles of leadership, making decisions together. There's probably a bunch more. But all of these different ways of structuring and forming the relationship between the governing board and the congregational executive. And then level three governance, also, once again, I'm not going to go through all these, but there are ways of making decisions in the operations and ministries of a congregation that are level three governance systems. So simple church is one, the equipping church is another, having ministry teams or structured committee systems, or even a volunteer staff system can be ways that you structure the decision making in the ministries and operations of the congregation. So you could have a congregation that at level one is practicing congregational polity, at level two is practicing dynamic governance, and at level three is practicing ministry teams. That actually would be an interesting mix for a congregation. But the thing to realize is that a decision being made at each of these levels, the expectations about how that decision is made may be different. Which we talked about this a few minutes ago. Governance level role confusion is the primary governance issue that I've ended up working with in governance consulting and congregations, and some of the examples of how this can manifest is I put in there board members who use their board authority to overrule a team lead in a ministry team meeting. So you're a board member. You're attending the religious education committee meeting because you're also a member of the religious education committee, or you're a parent who's very interested in the one issue, and you say, well, we are not going to let that decision by this committee happen because the board doesn't agree with it. One, you're probably not representing the whole board, but even if you did, that's really not the board's lane. That's the board being out of its space because this is a level three operational and ministry decision. The board affects that by setting policy, not by stopping something from happening in a committee meeting. A member who does not want to follow directions from staff because, quote, I vote your salary. That this is someone who I'm not going to stop bringing my pet to that's not a great example. I'm not going to stop doing whatever you staff member are telling me to stop doing because you work for me. This is someone who is confusing their level one role in the congregation as a member of the congregation who votes at the congregational meeting with the level three role of the staff managing to implement the policies, the ministries, and the mission of the congregation. Or an executive who does not follow direction from the board president because I am a called minister, I answer to the congregation, not to the board. We talked about that dynamic before. I will tell you it happens a lot. That direction from the board president coming as policy, this is someone who is taking their level one role and using it to say, I am not accountable to your level two authority. And commission lay ministers can also have a particular level of role confusion. This is my theory, but I've also seen this happen. Um, you, as commission lay ministers, you are commissioned to a level three operational and ministry authority within the congregation. And you have responsibility, direct responsibility for coordinating the congregation and for leading the congregation in some of the congregation's level three governance decision making and responsibilities. And this is based both on your lay ministry role and also your whatever responsibilities are in your commission. CLM members can at times um, confuse that level three authority with trying to then have similar levels of authority or kind of an impact on decisions that the congregation may make, both at level two at the board or level one at the congregational meeting. Um, I will tell you that staff sometimes also do this. Congregational staff will sometimes confuse. They're especially if they're also members. Well, sometimes confuse their level three authority with thinking that translates to decision making at level two and level one. But I will say this. When someone does that, whether it's staff or whether it is a commission lay minister, when you are taking authority that you rightfully hold at one level in a congregation's decision making and trying to apply it to other levels in the congregation's decision making, um, you damage trust. Um, you damage trust in you. You damage trust in, and you also damage the congregation's perception that you trust them. And that trust is essential to being able to do the work we are called to do in the operations and the ministries of our congregations. I will say that when I see a minister that is misusing their level three authority within the levels two and level one of a congregational system, and they are unwilling or unable to stop doing that, I can predict that their ministry is going to end within a year or two. Um, because they're damaging trust in two ways. They're damaging the trust that the congregation holds in them, and they are telling their fellow congregants, I don't fully trust you to be able to do this without me. That doesn't mean you can't give your opinions. That doesn't mean you can't influence. And that's why I think CLMs have a greater impact in the informal power systems within a congregation and keeping that in balance with the formal power systems within a congregation. Governance and levels under stress. Um, the, I won't say, I'll just say this. Whenever a system is under stress, it is natural that people go to the level of power where they think they have the level of congregational decision making, congregational governance, where they think they have the most power. Um, so if a congregational system is under stress, and I think I have the most power as a board member, then I will manifest my board role in that time under stress. If I think that it's the place I have the most power is as the leader of this operational team or system, I will manifest that. But it's natural that human beings under stress go to wherever we think we have the most power. And it's often because the informal power systems in our congregations are often stronger. People will go to leveraging their informal power system relationships under stress. So you might even be a board member, but yet you're leveraging the relationships you have to be able to influence people that may not have formal structural power systems to get behind you and doing the thing that you want. Um, the this is a natural human dynamic. We do it in relationships. We also do it in religious community. So a second question that I'm bookmarking for your later breakouts is, and we've done the much of the deep theory work for this workshop. A second question that I'm bookmarking for you all to think about in your breakout sessions. Um, I want you to think about a time when your congregation was under stress. Might be a conflict, might be financial issues, might be a staff transition. Think about a time your congregation was under stress. And then answer these questions. How did you see members attempting to leverage their formal or informal power in the decision-making process around that conflict or that stress or whatever it was? How did you see the members attempting to leverage their formal or informal power? And how did you attempt to be involved in the decision-making around whatever was creating that stress as a CLM in that conflict or stressful situation? And in what ways might you have been tempted to leverage your formal and informal power and authority in the issue, in that situation? And if you did, what was the result of that? This question is one that we'll come back to. You can come back to when you go into your breakout sessions. So I have through this, you're going to notice that I add a few thoughts on commission lay ministers and congregational governance. Much of this I've said. I think commission lay ministers have significant recognized authority for the implementation of the congregation's ministries and mission. Level three. You have a level of authority at level three that no one else members in the congregation really have. Much of the level three authority in a lot of congregations is reserved to staff, to some committee chairs, but commission lay ministers play a special role in the decision making of the congregation in the operations of ministry. And that it's tempting for for commission lay ministers when a congregation is under stress because you do have more knowledge, you do have more experience. You didn't likely become a commissioned lay minister without being a deeply involved Unitarian Universalist before that and deeply involved in the congregation. And so there's always the temptation to want to take some of that authority that you have at level three that's commissioned for you and utilize that to for the congregation to at level two and level one. And I think that's dangerous. I think it's dangerous because you're putting the trust you need to be able to do that good decision making, to be able to lead those ministries at level three in the operations and ministries of the congregation. You're putting that at risk in trying to engage in the level two decision making too strongly. Um, I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm saying it's a risk. Um, and the and that I think commission lay ministers often can play a really essential role in a congregation's governance by helping the informal power systems be in balance with the formal power systems and for there to be good communication, good, respectful interaction between structured formal power and relational informal power. Shifting to part three, and I am going to take a drink of coffee. I also figure you all can pause if you need to take a bathroom break, so y'all know where the pause button is. The common UU governance structures. So I thought about whether to have this in here, but the key is, as I said, congregations are endlessly governance creative. And we have created all kinds of ways to structure how to make decisions together. So from this point on, I'm talking mostly about formal power systems, about structures and organization, and not the informal power systems of relationships and history and money and influence. That both are essential parts of a congregation's governance structure of how we make decisions together. But in those formal power systems, there are some patterns that we see. And one of the first things I want to say is, as a governance consultant, I started off as a structuralist. I started off, 15 years ago by saying if we can just align this committee with this committee and this report's here, then everything will fall into place and we can perfectly. And I have learned that is so not true. I'm actually sometimes when I talk about this, I feel a little embarrassed about the naivete that I had in my early days as a governance consultant. The what I've come to is an agnosticism on structure. I almost do not care which committee reports to what committee or where. How as long as you've thought through it and people agree to it, it's probably fine. There are some exceptions to that rule. There are some things that are not a good plan. But for the most part, congregations tend to spend most of their energy when they're doing governance reform, when they've realized something's not working in how they're making decisions together. They tend to spend a whole lot of energy on structure. And I find that energy to not really make actual change. Um, the and that structural reforms don't actually change how power flows. They don't actually change the relationship between the informal power systems and the formal power systems. In some ways, the formal power system can restructure itself all it wants to if the majority, the strongest power system in the congregation is the informal power system. The formal power system can shift around all it likes. It's not actually changing anything. Um, that I put in there. There's almost an artistic level of creativity in our congregations. It's so true. We are endlessly creative when it comes to governance. Um, uh, The I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking today about the structures at level one because they're almost always a form of congregational polity, or at level three because that's a whole different workshop and takes a lot of time to talk through the different ways that an executive can structure the ministries and operations of the congregation. But what I want to highlight is the primary ways I've seen that we structure level two governance, that we structure the governing board and its relationship primarily to the executive, although it could be to other bodies such as a finance committee or an assessment committee or many others, but primarily between the board and the executive. Um, the the in smaller congregations, the ones with more operationally focused board, this is really becomes level two governance becomes how that board switches back from doing its more strategic level two work to doing its more operational level three work. Um, I'm going to just run through some of these different governance systems that we see often at level two, particularly between the board and the executive. The first one many of you have probably heard of, very few people likely fully understand, because I find that most people in Unitarian Universalism have heard of it but don't really have a deep understanding, is policy governance. This is a very structural, formalized system of accountability between the level two board and the level three executive. And it's built upon a model of a level three that understands itself, an executive that understands itself as subordinate to the board. I was a policy governance executive when I was the district executive of the Joseph Priestley District. I was not a member of the Joseph Priestley District Board. I was being held accountable by that board. And that board did a very good job, and they understood policy governance very well in utilizing the structural tools to be able to hold me accountable as the executive, hold me to both the ends, which might be called goals or values or missions, but what the board said I was to achieve. As the executive, the board says in policy governance, you are to achieve these things called ends. And then there are limitations. These are the things you, as the executive, are not allowed to do to try and achieve those ends. This is the core framework of policy governance that the board sets for the executive. These are the things you are to achieve, and these are the things you are not allowed to do trying to achieve the things you are to achieve. That tension, that relationship is the center of policy governance. This works really well in some congregations. It provides a level of clarity. Ministry, particularly when your executive is the ministry is often really murky. Policy governance, one of its benefits, is that it tries to get to some significant clarity about what the minister is to achieve. I have my own critiques of policy governance in congregational systems, primarily because I believe that there needs to be more of a partnership relationship between the executive when it's the minister and the board. And though you can have a partnership relationship under policy governance, under stress, policy governance is an adversarial system designed to be one of accountability, that you are to achieve these things and you are not allowed to do these things to achieve. And there is a firm boundary built into policy governance between what I would frame as level two governance and what is level three governance, what policy governance. Most often language they use is ends versus means. That ends is level two and means is level three. But it's a firm line that's divided, and the board has to be really disciplined to not move into means or level three. Um, Governance and ministry is another version. It's inspired by policy governance, but it's actually not a form of policy governance. Governance and ministry is a understanding that yes, this level two and level three divide exists, but there are some overlapping spheres of responsibility between the executive and the board, and they have to in relationship know how to work together in those overlapping spheres of partnership. Um, the board and the executive collaborate on those areas of shared responsibility, and they use policy to define the relationship, the process, and the practice. So policy is not do this, don't do this. Policy is in governance and ministry is this is how we are going to do these things together. These are the things that are the boards, these are the things that are the executives, and these are the things that we hold together, and this is how we're going to hold those things together. If you want to learn more, it's a wonderful book, Policy, Governance and Ministry by Dan Hotchkiss. There's two editions. I recommend reading the second one first, then go and read the third one to get the deeper theory. The third one. Go and read the first one to get the deeper theory. Another one, and I have personal ownership of this one, is mission-based governance, and that's a different workshop. I'm not going to do it today. But mission-based governance it kind of is comes out of a distillation of governance and ministry by Dan Hotchkiss, and it focuses on the board, and particularly teaching the board how to be a board, and teaching the board a way of being a board based in a series of practices. So if the board does these 7 things, and if there is something that the board is being asked to do or wants to do that isn't these 7 things, the board probably shouldn't be doing it. That belongs somewhere else. That belongs probably in either level 1 or level 3 of governance. Um, and it's the and the other thing about mission-based governance is that the foundation of all of the practices that the board does is based in the board having a deep lived understanding of the congregation's mission. Everything centers on the board having a growing, living, deep understanding, not just the mission statement, but what is the mission? What is the purpose of the identity of the congregation trying to create the vision that the congregation wants to bring into reality? Growing from that, the board then assesses how it uses the resources, whether those resources are being used well, how the congregation is keeping its deep partnerships, planning for the future. All of those pieces come out of a deep lived understanding of the congregation's mission. Strategic board is similar. It may use governance and ministry for theory and its structure, but it doesn't have as much of a policy structure as you find in a governance and ministry congregation, and it's centered on limiting what is the board's lane and what is the executive's lane. So these are the things the executive is focused on. These are the things the board is focused on, and the board limits in a strategic board structure. The board intentionally uses policy to limit its operational decision making. So two board governance. This is actually was more common at one time. It had a different name at the time, but two board governance systems are ones where there are separate board-like structures for level 2 and level 3. So you have a board that is the all the things that we've said in a level 2 board structure, but instead of having the minister or a staff team or a staff lay team, they have a separate board-like structure that functions as the operational executive and is responsible to the board. Often, this in congregations, this second structure, the second board-like structure, is called something like a church council or a committee of committees. And one of the ways it can be made up, they could be elected, or one may be made up of all the committee chairs from, but one board is responsible for the strategic direction of the congregation, and the other board is responsible for implementing the congregation's operations and mission. A liaison board is another structure that we see, which is where, and it's really an operational board structure. It's where, or moving towards an operational board structure, where board members are directly assigned to different aspects of the congregation's level 3 governance. So you have the board member who is the liaison to religious education, the board member that is the liaison to worship, the board member that is the liaison to the social justice committees, and they are not necessarily the committee chairs for those areas, but they're a board member that is specifically representing those aspects of the congregation within the level two governance structure of the congregational board. Another is the portfolio board. It's similar to liaison board, but this is one where the board members are actually the committee chairs. The board is made up not of board members that are liaisons to different operational aspects of the congregation, but the leaders of those operational aspects are also the board. This is a smaller congregational dynamic most often, although there are some larger congregations that have kept this structure. And probably one of the bigger challenges of this is that it really limits because it's the same people that are the committee chairs that are also the board. It has direct communication, creates a very operational board, but it also limits the amount that the board can do because they're also running the active parts of a ministry of congregations. I will say portfolio boards are really effective in congregations under 40 or 50 members. And this one, both portfolio board and the liaison boards can be really difficult for commission lay ministers to navigate because you might be the committee chair. You're deeply involved in the operations and ministry. So knowing how to balance when the board is doing more strategic work and when the board is functioning in more operationally for how you engage as a commission lay ministry. Dynamic governance is one I want to name. I am not the expert in it. There are people that are much better versed at teaching about dynamic governance than me. But to understand that it is a relational governance system where in circles of people that are interlocking, that have multiple people shared in relationship between them, form a linkage relationship between the level two strategic and the level three operational. And each circle is empowered in their area. So if you are the circle for worship, you're empowered in worship. And there's a couple people in your circle that are on the circle for ministries. And there's a couple people from that circle that are on the circle for governance, right? So the I didn't describe it well. If you're interested and if your congregation's engaging this, feel free. There's plenty of resources on Leader Lab and other places. And I think it's very interesting. It's just not the governance system that I most often operate in. So switching to part four, and this is governance process and practice. So the governance process is the how of making decisions together. Defining process is an inherent element of governance, and it's one of the clearest differences between formal and informal power in a governance system. Informal power also has a process, but it's never defined. And frankly, it's part of the learning how the informal power works is a significant part of learning how to access that informal power. The newer members in a congregation often report that they can't get access to being part of that informal power system because they don't know how it works. It's not written down anywhere. They don't. It's based in relationship and influence and history and so once again, we're talking primarily when we're talking process, talking primarily about formal power systems. But realize both have a process. You can just define and write down the formal power system process in a way you can't the informal power system process without doing something like power mapping, which some ministers do when they come into a congregation. So, level one, the process is rules of order or rules of procedure. Level two, the process is written into board policies, whether they're governance policies that define how the board and the executive function together, or operational policies, that describe how the congregation does things. And level three, these processes are written into committee team and procedures, and sometimes they're not written at all, or they're written on the back of a note card that's kept in the cabinet behind the coffee maker for how to make coffee on Sunday morning. The preeminence of practice is, if there's a thing that I have learned as a governance consultant, it is that you can put process in place, you can put structure, but how you do things is at the center. How a congregation makes decisions together defies, you have to very intentionally adapt that. Putting a new policy or practice into place doesn't change that. Congregations will make the number one guiding factor for our congregations to make decisions is how they've done it in the past. And changing that takes intentional relational work. It's an adaptive change, not a technical change. Um, One of the ways that you do make that change, however, is by intentionally working to change structure and process. And the only thing that changes a governance system, that changes the how we do it, is a few people choosing to practice differently and continuing to practice differently when the system tries to make them go back to whatever the system, however it was done before. If structure is how we are organized, uh, then and process is how we do things, then practice is the way we do things around here. And the um, practice is taking the structure and process and integrating them into the way decisions actually get made. And this takes time. Every congregation has practices. There is a practice for how the budget gets written. There is a practice for how a board agenda is developed. There is a practice or practices for how to manage informal power. I remember in one congregation that I mentioned before that part of the practice was I would call Mary after the board meeting and tell Mary what the board did so that Mary could then process whether Mary was going to have an issue with it. That was a practice that we did to help manage those informal power systems based upon the actions of the formal power system. Wasn't a good practice, but it was a practice that we had. And what I've learned as a consultant is that practice is everything. Is that helping people to adapt their practices and helping to encourage leaders who want to change some of the practices of a congregation is the most effective coaching I can do to help a congregation shift how they are making decisions together into ways that are more inclusive, into ways that are more balanced between formal and informal power, into ways that help balance that efficiency versus the inclusion, that helping people to develop better practices. And this is a place where I think CLMs have a specifically effective role, is because you can be trendsetters in setting those practices within a governance system in a way that some other people cannot because of the official role of your commissioning. And also, commissioned lay ministers can really leverage good practice and practicing well and doing that in modeling in their level three decision making roles. To be able to show the ways that the congregation wants to make decisions together, to be the method is the message on how we make decisions together and how we build community with one another. That really the CLM's role in level three governance, along with the staff, along with the minister, along with uh, your congregation might have affiliated community ministers, those that have a formal level three authority for the ministries and operations of the congregation really do become the teachers of practice in how we make decisions together. How you make decisions in your ministries as a commissioned lay minister helps impact the cultural expectations around making decisions together throughout the rest of the congregational system. And you can be the great coach in helping people to make those decisions together well within a congregational culture of inclusive decision making that is balanced and that is in line with the congregation's values and mission. And my big caution for CLMs when you're operating, when you're feeling the draw as a member of the congregation, you want to leverage some of that authority that you have on level three into decision making that the congregation is making at level two or level one, not because you're power hungry or anything, but because you deeply care about whatever it is that the congregation is working with in those board or congregational meeting decisions. My big caution is to realize that when you leverage your level three authority, you're putting it at risk. You're putting the trust at risk. I have this conversation with ministers all the time, and with religious educators. You have been given authority in the operate for the operations and ministry of the congregation when you try to translate that authority. And if you can do so effectively at times, that can even be really useful, but realize the danger that you are putting that authority at risk in the two ways. You're putting it at risk in one, the people who don't agree with you not trusting you in your level three role anymore, or two, the people maybe even that agree with you that take the message that you didn't trust them to do the leadership that was necessary on the thing, whatever the thing is. If you become too much of a player at level two or level three, I believe you're less able to serve as a coach in the practice at those levels of governance, and also that you put at risk your authority that you rightfully hold as a commissioned lay minister for at level three in the ministries and operations of the church, of the congregation. Thank you all for inviting me to come talk at you for a while. You can tell this is kind of, I tell people that I'm an ecclesiologist, not a I'm not a theologian, I'm an ecclesiologist. I help people practice religious community. And how we make decisions together as a congregation is one of the most essential, central spiritual practices of being in religious community together. And it's a thing that is really hard for us human beings to do and to do well. And it is the place where I think we most live our values. And sometimes people think governance is something that takes us away from the spiritual mission of the congregation. And that's so not true for me. It is, to me, how we make decisions to get together is one of the central spiritual acts of being a Unitarian Universalist. It's wonderful to have been virtually with you all in this way, and I look forward to any questions and answers that you may have, um, uh, and to hearing about your experience in the breakout sessions. See you all for real soon.